Kann man beginnen? Okay, do you hear me? Yes. Welcome to my talk on decoupling Drupal with GraphQL and Twig. Quick fact check if you're in the right room, as you still have the chance to leave. This talk is part of the Drupal and Technology track, which is sponsored by Platform SH. Thank you very much for that. Yes, and as I already said, it's about decoupling Drupal with GraphQL and Twig. Short note about my person. My name is Philip. I'm a lead engineer at AmazyLab Zurich. The community knows me better as the other guy who is into GraphQL. And talking about being into GraphQL, I would like to start with a quick audience survey. Who never heard about GraphQL or is not aware of the concept? Okay. Other question, who worked with atomic design, pattern libraries, pattern lab, or something similar before? Okay. And who has been in Adam Duran's workshop in the morning? A couple of, okay. You have been there, by Adam. So let's start with a quick introduction. What is GraphQL? By example, what we see on the left here is a GraphQL query that you could send to your Drupal server, and it will respond with this JSON object on the right. This query consists of basically functions that get executed and produce a result. For this example, the query defines that we should call a function called nodeById with a node ID as a certain argument. And in this case, that's the name and the double colon before alias it in the result to the name node. And that's what we see on the right. We get in our result set, there is a nested JavaScript object that is called node. And that's what this line does. Then the next line applies a function called entity label that will accept the input of the nodeById function before and pull out this node's label and add it to the result set as we see it on the right. Body and process roughly work the same. I won't go into too much detail here. What's perhaps a little more interesting is like this related articles function is something that is not on the node object in Drupal itself. It's, in this case, it might not even be a field, but it's just some function that, again, accepts this node object that is emitted by nodeById and calculates some result. In this case, it would execute a views configuration that takes the node as a contextual argument and does some perhaps tags magic or whatever to calculate which other articles are related and returns them as an array of, again, node objects. And on each of these node objects that are part of this result, we again apply the same entity label function that we had before on these objects to get the label. So we can reuse functions throughout our query and to get the results we want. So what is GraphQL? How would you define GraphQL? GraphQL is multiple things. On the one hand, it's a JavaScript reference implementation. That's what you would find if you search for GraphQL on GitHub, probably. It's a GraphQL server that you can run and implement your own custom schemas in. But there are a lot of JavaScript, of GraphQL implementations. There is, by now, 3 popular ones for PHP and for basically any other language too. On the other hand, GraphQL is a language specification. So it's the definition of how this query that we've seen before has to look like. So it's the specification document. And from a software architecture point of view, and I think that's the most important one, I would define GraphQL as a framework to combine and compose simple input-output functions to a lot more complex operations. Like we've seen before, we have simple functions like get me the node by ID and get me the label of one node or get me the processed body text of one node, and we can just chain and combine them to achieve a complex result. Since a lot of people already heard of GraphQL, and I bet they heard of GraphQL in a very certain context, which is Decouple Drupal, we should perhaps talk about what GraphQL is not. So GraphQL is not a supplement to React. It's not like you need GraphQL only if you use React. GraphQL was kind of born out of the need of complex web interfaces that are shaped in a tree-like manner, and that's the way React works. So this kind of went hand in hand, but they are not bound together. The other very, very important thing is GraphQL is not a replacement and does not compete with REST or JSON API. These are drastically different things. So if you ever get to the point in your project where you ask yourself, should I use GraphQL or should I use JSON API, perhaps you should go back to the chalkboard and rethink your requirements. And the last point also goes into that direction. GraphQL itself is not concerned about HTTP, not at all. We often hear the complaints that GraphQL doesn't care about HTTP and it doesn't care about HTTP caching, and therefore you would rather use REST, and that's not in the scope of GraphQL to think about HTTP. Nevertheless, we use GraphQL over HTTP a lot, which I would call the world's most common edge case. So this is the way it was promoted to get some benefits, to reduce bottlenecks in decoupled applications or in rich web front-end applications. One of them is that you can reduce overfetching. Like with a REST interface, you would request your object and you just get everything that's in there. The other benefit would be that you can reduce the server round trips. Like in our example before, REST for these related articles would just return the ID, and to just get every related article's title, you would have to do another REST request to get this information. And it gives us, in general, more flexibility than REST when used in this context. But, and that's where you would think about when you would not use GraphQL, you have to keep an eye on your client. Who is executing the query? What is he executing? You should probably be very careful to publicly open a GraphQL API without really knowing its in and outs and its potential risks. But as soon as you know the client, may this be because you developed the client application yourself, which is the case for basically every Decoupled Drupal project, or your API is gated by a login, like the public GraphQL API that GitHub published is only accessible with an authorization token, so they know who is doing funky stuff. But we can use GraphQL also outside of the context of HTTP. And these are some other ideas. One, which I think is a great idea because it shows the difference. You could use GraphQL to define REST endpoints. A REST endpoint could be just something like one stored GraphQL query that gets executed if you send the GET request to a certain path. with an argument, and then you get the result of the query. You don't need to encode, fetch your object, or prepare the result. You can just define one GraphQL query, and you get the result out of it. One other great idea that we had, and we will probably at some point implement, is who is working with Search API or has worked with Search API? A lot. Then you know the field definition interface of which field should be part of your index. This could be just one GraphQL query as we've seen it before. You could traverse as deep as you want. You can even add other resolvers if you want to add different fields or other information to your index. This could all work. And the idea that we're going to talk about today is you could feed Twig templates outside of the context of HTTP. And now we're going to talk about GraphQL and Twig, decoupling Drupal within Drupal. To get started, that's very easy. You just have to enable the GraphQL core module and the GraphQL Twig module. The GraphQL module itself will be enabled because it's a dependency. GraphQL core will give you all the resolvers, all the fields that we created for on behalf of Drupal core itself. So you can query nodes, access all the fields, resolve routes, and get the node that the route points to, all this stuff. And GraphQL Twig immediately does nothing by itself, but you just have to grab one unprepared template by the neck and inject a GraphQL query, as we see it here. Just within a Twig command, you add this GraphQL query, and this will, in the result in a GraphQL, a new template variable called GraphQL that will return, on the one hand, the returned data set, and also a potential array of errors. But in this case, important is that we get the node data field that we defined in our query, and then we can just use this node variable and output and use it in our Twig template the way we want. So quickly, let's sum up what happened here. During the Twig compile step, sorry? Which? I understand this, but will you explain how it is used? Yeah, this later on. I just wanted to start with an example. So the Twig compile step picks up this query. So when the Twig template gets parsed, it will find this attached query that can also be just a .gql file with the same name as the template file. So either you put it in the command on top or as a separate file. That's a matter of preference. And add this to the compiled Twig template. And on render time, it will investigate the query arguments that are assigned to this query and try to match them to existing template variables. So in our example before, in the node template file, we already have a node variable. That is, in this case, an entity, but that's some little magic that it's transformed into an ID. And then you can use it to pass it into the node by ID function and just pull out any information that you want. So that's the query matching. Then it executes the query and just adds the variable to the Twig result, to the Twig variables, and then you can use it. So there's not much more happening. So what are the benefits of this? You can ditch pre-processing. You can, if you need more information in your template about whatever, you can just add these information requirements directly to the template, which also helps to get a very clear distribution of responsibilities, because the themer or the person that creates this visual component has to define what information is required to display this component. And If some of the fields are not there yet, the back-end developer, as we call it, can add field implementations to actually pull this information. But the front-end developer can already rely on a certain data structure and create mock data to just test this component outside of Drupal context. Yes?
This very much sounds like writing SQL queries in a template, which was taboo.
That's true. The difference is that GraphQL queries are not SQL queries because they are not bound to any kind of implementation. I can create any kind of GraphQL server that just implements this interface definition, and we don't care where the information comes from. And we also have very tight control of what is executed because we define the schema, we define which objects contain which fields and what information can be fetched. And there's another very important thing because the main reason not to put SQL queries in template files is that people that don't know about performance or of the performance bottleneck of databases, that all these queries get executed over and over and over, and that queries could become too complex. A GraphQL query can be parsed into an abstract syntax tree, and we can actually measure its complexity. So you could get to a point, if you give this to other people, this tool, you can measure how many fields are queried, how complex these fields are, and how deep the nesting is, and at some point just say, okay, that's too complex, I'm not going to process it. You have to find another way. So there are safety layers in there. And so this is distribution of responsibilities, and we achieve a very reasonable data flow. So in Drupal we have the problem that a template gets the already rendered result of another template pushed through. And it's very hard to find out, okay, which pre-processing did happen, where does this data come from, where does this object come from. And this is something that's becoming very clear here, because you just look at the template, and you see, okay, that's the query, that's where the variables come from. And then one very good example to use this is Pattern Lab. So that's why the question about atomic design. Atomic design allows us to create reusable components that we mesh together and assemble to more complex layouts. And we achieve design consistency. We can organize our front-end components, our JavaScript and CSS code. And it all sounds great. We've tried it a lot of times. And we always kind of, well, not hit the complete wall, but Drupal doesn't really support you in this, because Drupal just works the other way around. It doesn't push data into templates, and then this data just is distributed, but it first renders the inner templates and pushes them through the outer templates. And that's why this applying this atomic design pattern in Drupal is so hard, and we need a lot of different tools to get around it. Either we have to do excessive pre-processing in our theme to, if we actually want to reuse this Twig template that we have in Pattern Lab, you have to prepare the variables the way the component requires them, and you have to cope with templates that are semantically not relevant, for example, to your user interface. Like views just throws 3 template files in front of your feet for one rendering, and you might not even want to think about that. Then another thing we often have to do is creating bridge templates. This means you have one template in your theme that, for example, correlates to the node template. And in there, you include the template from your pattern library that you actually want, and somehow map variables between them. And this is also often very hard. and also additionally, to test Pattern Lab properly without Drupal itself, which is the main reason for it. So front-end developers can quickly iterate over designs and design in the browser. You have to create very complex mechanisms for mock data to simulate this render the inner part before the outer part way of Drupal. So how could we use GraphQL to work better with Pattern Lab? Because obviously we don't want a new GraphQL query on every molecule. This would be the problem of similar to the SQL query in templates. But GraphQL has the concept of query fragments. Query fragments are kind of a reusable information requirement. It's basically a function that you can call, and it will inject exactly these information requirements of the entity label, the path, and the processed summary of a node at this certain point of a query. And corresponding to this, we just have a simple template that renders an article teaser using the node's path, a node's title, and the processed summary. This all relates to the query on the left. And if we then, sorry for this wall of code, but the actual important part is not very big. On the left is our example query before. The only part that changed is that instead of just pulling the entity label of our related articles, we apply the teaser fragment, which will make sure that all information that this teaser template requires is also added to our query string. And on the right, we just include teaser.html.twig, which is this teaser twig file that is lying around somewhere, either in Pattern Lab or just in our theme or wherever we need it. And we pass in the result of our related articles field. So we're looping over all the related articles we find, and we pass to the teaser template each row of this result set named as variable node. So it properly corresponds to this template. The assembly of this query happens automatically. So when Twig is compiled, it will just traverse the tree of all included templates and collect all query fragments that are in there. So if you execute the query, everything you need is there. As said, this happens during the Twig compile step, so there is no performance impact on it. You can nest as deep as you want. In the end, it will be just one query that's executed. One caveat here is that this won't work with dynamic includes. So in Twig, you have the ability to pass a variable to this instead of having the hard-coded string here, you could pass in a variable and include something dynamically, but then we can't collect the query because we don't know in advance what it is. So the one question that I always get is, can we go all the way? Is this enough? This concept is the same as we use GraphQL with React. So it's modeled after how Apollo can collect queries from different React components. But the important answer here is that we don't have to. So the main reason for GraphQL in Twig is to gradually decouple Drupal. So this process can be applied to any Twig template. You can just grab any Twig template within your big layout and start injecting data using GraphQL. You don't have to go all the way and just create the whole page and everything using GraphQL, which is a good thing because, for example, we don't cover some very important modules yet, like web form. We don't have a solution for a decoupled web form because you would have to recreate all the form widgets in your whatever client framework. But it just augments additional traditional rendering. So if you have a template function, a template file, and you add a GraphQL query, you just end up with one additional template variable that you can use and that can add any data that you want. That being said, there is the idea of having a pure GraphQL rendering process, like a Drupal theme engine that would actually throw away all pre-processing and just purely operate on GraphQL and assemble Twig templates. So, as we've heard, decoupling is the real power of GraphQL. So it's not about having less HTTP round trips or being able to define which fields I want or which name they are. The real power of GraphQL is this, that you can semantically decouple your front end and your back end. This front end may also be in the back end, as with Twig. But are we decoupled yet? So if we look at this query, it shouts Drupal on basically every line. So the front end has to know that node by ID pulls you something that is called node, which might then be an article, and that I get the title from the entity label, and I have to know that I have to use the processed version of the body text, or else I will open up an XSS vulnerability. So these are all things that the front end actually should not have to know about. And that's where a new feature comes in that we have been developing, GraphQL schema definitions. This is also a part of the GraphQL specification, and it's a way to define your GraphQL schema's type system. This example, we have a query. The query object is the very root of your GraphQL query. So these are the root, it defines the root fields that you're able to execute to initially get data. Here we have a field that is called article that takes the ID and returns an object of type article. This type article has a title, has a summary, has a URL, has a content string, which already should be the completely safe content string to be rendered somewhere or output. And it has an array of related other articles, which again are of this same type. And this schema definition allows us to write much more concise and more understandable GraphQL queries. So in this case, the front end can't do a lot wrong, and it's much more able to understand what is going on. This has been published in an experimental way. So in our GitHub namespace, there's a module called GraphQL SDL that allows you to basically right now create your own schema plugin, import such a schema definition string, and then you attach resolver plugins, which are basically just functions that take arguments and spit something out, and apply them to your schema. And you can design this in a very reusable way, as I will quickly show afterwards. So right now, this still happens just in code, but we have plans to put this into first configuration files and eventually in a user interface that allows you to apply these resolvers to your GraphQL fields, which will resemble rules probably. Just a quick look on how this would work out. In this example, we're defining the URL field on the article type, and we are composing two other plugins. The first one is entity URL, which will take the entity, you pass it in, and return the URL object of this entity's canonical URL. And the second one is another simple function that just takes in a URL and creates the absolute path as a string. So you have two atomic functions that can be combined in different ways. So what's the benefit here? The main benefit is that your schema now reflects your domain vocabulary. So you don't have to teach the client application Drupal and how Drupal looks like and how Drupal works and that it has entities and processing and views results. But you can really dig into what your problem domain looks like, into your problem domain's scope and vocabulary. You get very robust API design because you have one definition, and even if you change the underlying implementation, nothing will break. Right now, the GraphQL module has an automatically generated schema that will change every time you remove a field or add a field to a content type. And there are even cases where it might change without your consent by a Drupal update, for example, that changes how that type data works. So we had this during our developments. And what we achieve is actual decoupling. Because right now, also with REST and JSON API, we just decouple the front end. We make the front end replaceable, but the front end is still strictly bound to one backend. With schema definitions, you can achieve real decoupling by having a front end that can bind to any backend that just signs this contract that we have with the schema definition. And the question is, who needs this? Your friendly neighborhood car manufacturer does. And we're very happy to get funded by Daimler. We're working with them in a large-scale project where, in this case, the front end, for example, is developed by a whole different company. And GraphQL schema definitions play an integral role to facilitate the communication between the teams because it's a contract that everybody can agree on, and it makes communication between front-end and back-end teams a lot more easy. Yeah, and I would like to give a shout-out to Daimler at this point and to the team that we're working with, because they actually approached us with the wish to contribute to open source. And this GraphQL schema definition module is the first contribution that will be a result of this project. And hopefully there are a lot more to come. At least we have a lot more planned. So a quick applause. So for closing words, let's quickly talk about decoupling Drupal. So a tale about layers. Back when I was at university, like 15 to 20 years ago, and Drupal was emerging. The web was built in a very layered way, and we had CSS, and CSS is replaceable, and you can use the same website and just swap out CSS, and you get a different design, and that's awesome. So this was the common agreement there. I think it didn't work out quite. So what we are currently now at is this kind of, we're vertically slicing our front-end layer. So we have these front-end components. We try to achieve this either with React or also with Twig and Pattern Lab. So we get like these separated parts we can reassemble, but we still have problems to, in a clean way, split up Drupal's markup because of the reasons that we were talking about before. And I think, that's my opinion, is that the reason for this whole decoupled movement and why people are so interested in this is not because of React, because there are not a lot of projects in a size that they actually justify the use of React. A lot of Drupal websites are just information websites that would just load as fast from Varnish as they would load with React. It's often not worth the cost. But people are running in this direction because of all these roadblocks that Drupal puts in our way if we want to take full control of the rendering and the display layer. And where we actually want to go to is vertically slice all the things, as it now happens with React. If you go for a fully decoupled project that has a React or Vue or Angular application at the front, the important difference is that this application pulls data. So the application itself, the representation, is in full control. It's leading the project. And Drupal will just conform to the contract that it needs to fulfill to give the application all the data that it needs. And this is the important invert of direction that makes decoupled applications so much better to develop. Since Drupal is still in this mindset of we're building the page from bottom up, then we throw 500 hooks into it that alter something somewhere, and then something comes out. And this, for large projects, this barely ever turns out maintainable. So I think that we will have to eat our own dog food and decouple Drupal within Drupal first before we start to add React. Decoupling, I was told, is not about HTTP requests. It's actually about separating concerns. So I think we have to resolve this problem internally first before we start to handle HTTP problems. And in general, to be a feasible solution for large-scale projects as we do them with Daimler here, Drupal has to become a good servant that doesn't enforce its own rules, but can adapt to whatever requirement the environment brings. Last but not least, I would like to thank Sebastian, who is on the front here, who is equal parts pain in the ass and inspiration, and did a lot of awesome work on the schema definitions for us. And in general, the GraphQL module wouldn't exist without him. Then, become a Drupal contributor tomorrow. I know the password is contribute today, but tomorrow is also important. For me, contributing to Drupal and to open source was very important because at university I learned to mathematically prove that a compiler works correctly, which I never use in my day-to-day life now, yay. But contributing told me how to work in a big team, communicate with other people, and work on code. So contributing to Drupal is not about just making Drupal better, it's about making yourself better. Questions? Yes?
So now if we're talking about decoupling, and the last but not the least slide in your was telling that frontend now rules and then Drupal doesn't do his own rules.
Yeah.
And then the obvious question comes, how to do the versioning of the API?
So there is an unspoken rule a GraphQL API never breaks, it evolves. So with GraphQL, you always have the ability to just add new fields if you need them. And you can deprecate fields, which essentially means they will disappear from all the inspection and the documentation, but they still work. And then you could, in theory, run like statistics on how often a field is used, and if it's not used anymore, you can delete it.
So there is no way to know from front end that like something changed in Drupal?
No, that's the reason for the schema definition. If Drupal changes something, it will, well, Drupal will shout at you if you don't apply all the resolvers to the schema definition that the front end gives you, or that you import.
Just because, for example, when you create the mobile app, like on Android or iOS, and then you can't force all the users to update at one time. That's like really a question. Then you create new mutations, or you create new, I don't know, functions for related articles that you showed in the example, and how to achieve that they will benefit from your new changes.
Well, in this case, so you can't force all users to update at one time. So you have users with the old client and users with the new client. If you update your GraphQL schema in a way that it doesn't break old functionality, then the old clients will just continue to work. And the new clients will too.
Are there any set of rules that like how
well,
to update?
the rule is don't delete an existing field, obviously, or change its type. What you still can do, but that's not the idiomatic way, is just create two endpoints. You could have your old schema definition running on one endpoint and the new schema definition of a new endpoint. That's how you would create a GraphQL/v2 something. But history tells that this is not a good idea.
Okay, thank you.
Yes?
What about processing privileged information?
What do you mean by that?
Let's say I have fields on a node or so that I don't want to expose to every role.
You just
something similar.
You don't add them to your schema.
Okay.
Anything else? Yes.
My question is about the GraphQL caching. Since all the filters comes in the request body, how would it work with the static caching like varnish or anything?
So caching in general uses Drupal's cache metadata system. In the current implementation of the GraphQL module, the whole request will be cached. So from all result sets that are part of this query, the cache information is collected, and then one cache for this specific query is created, along, obviously, with the argument that might change the query result. With the SDL implementation and this next version, we will actually be able to implement subtree caching. So we can also, you have this whole tree of your query result, and you could also query just, cache just the result of one specific field further down. So then caching becomes a lot more flexible. Did this answer the question?
No, but for instance, if with the varnish cache based on the URL just.
Yeah.
But with the GraphQL, the URL would always stay same. Arguments goes within the body, request body. So if you use calling the same URL for different requests with a different body, varnish is going to cache the first request.
No, this depends on how you set it up. So for a GraphQL query that only pulls data, so no mutation is done, actually the argument should be passed as get parameters. So they just run into varnish cache. And one thing that you do in production is actually use persisted queries, which means your client creates like a compiled dictionary of all the queries that he uses, and just passes Drupal the ID, and Drupal then gets this query and executes it. And there where it actually becomes very similar to REST. So then it's just one simple path with some get parameters.
Okay, thanks.
Yes?
Hi, thank you for the presentations. I wonder, in the Daimler project,
Sorry?
in the Daimler project,
Yeah.
Why Daimler choose to use Drupal? Because it seems like you can use any other backends, for instance, like Symfony project. So why Drupal as a backend? I mean, is it the admin UI needed, or why Drupal? Do you know about it?
The reason, well, actually they approached us directly with the wish to do Drupal. So this decision was made before I was part of this project. The way I can tell now is that they're intrigued by the community. They want an open source project and they want to participate here. And obviously the other reasons are flexibility and the strengths in data structuring and workflows. Back there is another one.
So actually, if the GraphQL is embedded into the Twig template, this same GraphQL query will be executed every time this Twig template is loaded, right?
Yes.
What about authors in the backend using the preview function? They want to access a specific revision, an unpublished revision of this node.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one important part that I did not talk about before. No, there is no HTTP request involved. So the Twig template, when it executes the query, it just uses the GraphQL processor service, and it's actually the same user. So you have the same user access rights as the current author that is visiting the page.
Yeah, but you were only requesting an ID, a node ID, and not a specific revision.
but you're still in the same Drupal process. So you have the currently logged in user is the same.
And so if the user would normally get the newest revision because he's the author of this content, he will as well get the same revision during the GraphQL process.
Well, there is also a specific GraphQL field for pulling a certain revision, and this would be the one that you use for displaying a preview.
Okay. Additional question, any chance to get an overview about all the available functions and fields? I guess there should be some.
This is the current schema. Yeah, I'm not going to count them now.
Okay, but this is considered to be a helper for the
yes, you have
front-end
this.
developer.
There is for every GraphQL schema that you define, you have this schema path prefix, and then you can put either Voyager, which renders this GraphQL Voyager application, where you can just follow all your connections within your schema, and there's also the Graphical Explorer, where you can play around. For example, here we have a node object, and then with control space you can check, okay, which fields are defined for this node object, what can I get out of here, and you can also search here for types and fields. So we have the node article, and the article has all these fields, and yeah,
cool.
You get the idea.
Thank you very much.
There's another one.
Thank you for your session. Question is about permissions. Do you play with that, and how we can deal with that? So how we can separate access for different nodes and also for, I guess, mutations, for example.
The built-in schema 100% respects Drupal's access permissions on entity access. So if a user tries to access a node that he has no access to, it will just return null in this case. So this just works. Yeah, this is mainly, and for all other subsystems that might pull in other Drupal services, we also always ensure that access restrictions are met and work the same way as they would work for Drupal without GraphQL.
Okay, and in which way you authorize the user?
To use GraphQL itself? Or
no, not from internal, but from external, for example, for React application. So you authorize user, and how you deal with which user is that accessing GraphQL.
Okay, that's something we did in projects with OpenAuth so far. So you basically, OAuth.
Okay.
So you generate an OAuth token with the OAuth module that Drupal country provides, and you just send this token as a request parameter along with your GraphQL request.
Each time, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Got it. Thanks a lot.
There's another one.
If you would go all the way, as you described, having GraphQL queries in the templates, in the current Drupal installation, how would that compare in performance? Because I got the idea that both the backend, the modules, and your template now both perform a query on the data.
Well, we didn't try it. In general, we know that it's not slower than standard Drupal because we can optimize a lot, and we can optimize a lot more within a GraphQL query because we know the query structure in advance than a render array could. But we don't have a case where we have like a real full Drupal site that is. It's also the main reason for this is not to completely replace Drupal's rendering right now, but to gradually, or should I say progressively, decouple Drupal.
Thank you.
There's yet another one.
So how's the support for the media module and the GraphQL integrations? Is it that something which is supported just like the entities?
Yes, so media is fully supported in terms of all entities are just added to the GraphQL schema. Additionally, we have resolvers for field derivatives, image derivatives. So you can request different styles of images. That's essentially it. There's not more. Ben. Okay, thank you very much. If you have more questions, I'll be around until